Here.
Just as a quick note, I prefer verbal POI, so if someone's going to ask a POI, just feel free to unmute. I'm just going to jump right into the speech because I have 5 different arguments and rebuttal. To begin with, let's chat a little bit about why it is the case this stops mass starvation. Afterwards, I'm going to talk about democracy, the formation of cities. I'm going to talk about technological innovation and growth, war, and peace. Let's start off with mass starvation. I'm just going to make 2 different observations about why we stopped the starvation of millions of people through mass industrial revolution. The first observation is that this allowed for the production of food in a much more efficient way. The problem with individualized systems of farms was that you didn't ever reach economies of scale. And because productive capability was lower, it meant that there were natural constraints. The fact that, for instance, you didn't have machines that could assist you in the harvesting of food. This is why in the period before the Industrial Revolution, there was mass starvation and people suffering on the ground. The closest modern analogy is actually the choice of the Great Leap Forward in China, where millions of people died from famines as a consequence of disaggregating all these farms and returning it back to individual management rather than collective farms. So as a trivial observation, millions of people's lives were saved as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. The second thing that I want to observe is that even apart from the human lives that are saved from the Industrial Revolution through starvation prevention, we also had things like the development of medication and innovation that allowed for vaccinations to be made to stop people from dying from trivial illnesses. Treatments and medications that meant that if someone got cholera, they were no longer given a death sentence. This is a massive benefit in the sense that over the course of the last 150 years or more, there have been literally millions, hundreds of millions of people whose lives have been saved by this, potentially billions. Now, I do want to point out here that the comparative on animal life is pretty clear. Even the most staunch vegans would agree that you would never trade off 1 chicken for 1 human. And obviously the ratio isn't precisely as follows, but I think we already put a premium on human life. The reason is partially because utilitarianism is saying that a being feels pain isn't a very good justification for granting rights. All people and moral philosophers already criticize Peter Singer for his implication that says, if you give animals rights on the basis of pleasure or pain, it means that people who have development disabilities or people who end up being in positions of development that mean that they can't experience cognition at high levels also correspondingly do not deserve rights under a utilitarian framework. We think that is morally abhorrent, and we think that conception of rights cannot stand. We prefer a conception of rights that is more human-centric. The second observation that I want to make in this speech is that this massively granted people the ability to control their governments and redistributed power. I'm going to give you 3 different reasons why that is the case. First of all, the fact that people now had the ability to advance in life because of their productive capability rather than nobility. Remember, before the Industrial Revolution, the way in which a party had power was through having land. They owned land, they were able to turn it into a productive capability through agrarian production. But this meant that landowners who largely got this land from unjust means like invasions, colonialism, etc., were able to entrench their privilege as the only asset that could continue to reap gains was land. In the counterfactual world, the way in which you actually end up allocating funding and in which people are economically productive is through the ownership of different assets. And the fact that the average person now can produce more goods means that the real value of wages increases for the average person under a marginal value of labor theory. This means that every single person is now enriched, and it means that you decentralize money from the same groups of elites. This is what prompted, for instance, the ability to get voting rights for individuals, as they now had an economic stake. But even past that, the fact that you had cities which could be created because now you could urbanize, as no one had to tend their individual farms, meant that mass groups of discontented workers and individuals formed together to create protests and democratic groups that ended up keeping states accountable and moved them from autocracies. Second of all, I just want to point out that slavery was also disrupted as economic relations shifted, because no longer was it the model in which you needed to create agricultural gains, but instead you focused on other sorts of labor. And that meant that you focused on, for instance, educating your own workforce rather than compelling slaves who are typically unskilled labor to try and grow your economy. Finally, I just want to point out that broadly speaking, because developing countries had unfairly gotten their land taken away, now that they could compete on other grounds economically, this recentered the playing field and gave developing countries the ability to develop in a different and alternative way, which actually allowed them to break into the international sphere. The implication of this is that millions of people's lives are now better off because they can control states and they aren't put in positions of destitution. Next, as I mentioned before, cities are formed. I think that there are a few trivial benefits that come from cities. First of all, it means that you have significantly more diversity in groups coming together. You're much more likely to have the phenomenon of social contact. And that's why in urbanized locations in the US and anywhere else in the developed world, you have higher rates of left-wing voters than right-wing voters because there's exposure to other minority groups. Moreover, I want to point out that there are trivial benefits for people within minority groups. The fact that you're more likely to be able to find a cultural group that you can identify with, the fact that, for instance, if you're gay, you're much more likely to be able to find someone who is also gay in that same city. All these sorts of communities that can be formed from marginalized groups is massively beneficial for their political activism and for their individual lives. Fourth, on war and peace, I just want to point out that colonialism is uncomparative in this debate. Half of the Americas was already suffering from diseases due to the conquistadors engaging in colonialism. On our side of the house, we actually gave developing countries the ability to get technology and other goods to disrupt this massive imbalance, because industrialization meant that you could mass produce weapons. The problem was that beforehand, the British had weapons, but because it wasn't mass produced, it wasn't easily accessible for other groups, and the lack of a flow of global capital meant that this cannot be redistributed. In this world, you're much more able to have an equitable distribution of all of these arms, meaning that the developing world was able to actually have some degree of influence and some deterrence. Moreover, the fact that there are now bigger trade links that come from the integration of economies and the fact that you are no longer just trading trivial goods means that there are incentives not to invade or attack other countries, which means that you're more likely to have peace on aggregate. And the creation of nuclear weapons, I would posit, also has created deterrence that stops war in the long run. Fifth and finally, I just think trivially, technology makes our lives better. It's pretty cool that a Croat and a Canadian can call and participate in an overnight debate tournament. I think that there are just trivial benefits of technology that make us happier, the fact that we have movies, all of those sorts of things. Rebuttal on climate change. I just want to be clear on all the existential risks that they talk about. These are speculative harms. We might be able to solve them with technological innovation, and there are good reasons to believe that these issues might not occur. They have to explain why the speculative risk outweighs the millions of lives, the hundreds of millions of lives that we save. But on a secondary level, I want to posit the non-identity problem. Believes that each individual can only be wronged if it was that their counterfactual world would have been worse off. What this means is, in a world in which the Industrial Revolution didn't happen, every single person that lives today would be a different person entirely because, for instance, their parents would have met in different ways, there's a butterfly effect. But the fact is, that means that all the people we are today end up dying because we don't exist. So on the comparative, it's not clear that this is actually necessarily worse off for people because it shifts the identity of individuals in a way that we no longer have moral obligations to one another. I'm very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister and remind whoever is recording to stop recording. Fine speech, and I welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Then I will start soon. The context of this debate is your average human before Industrial Revolution was almost, and in large cases, literally owned by their aristocrat or feud or slave owner, lived in horrible conditions with no food, no sanitation, no access to medicine, education, safety, recourse to government, being killed by Black Plague in 14th century, and without any higher levels of cognition rather than to just survive the next day, month, or year. The anti-natalism argument is the only one I want to engage directly with open government, and then I'm going to move on to extending our case and explaining the comparative. Look, anti-natalism didn't exist before because there was no choice for people not to have kids, because they needed kids for survival, because they had to work the field. Otherwise, when you are old, you're going to die because you can't work the field. But there was no knowledge and widespread acceptance. This is even possible in times of absolute natalism by religion and by necessity that was enforced in that time. Not to mention people who actually want to have children would continue having them on their side of the house, but these children would die in pain and misery more than 30% of time, which basically doesn't happen on our side of the house. I first want to talk about the principal argument, maybe if this comes from closing argument. If you really care about principal arguments, you care about most people's ability to access these principal arguments. Mech number one, people read and write largely because of the Industrial Revolution. Secondly, people get education largely because of the Industrial Revolution, because being able to, think about these things, finance these things, live in cities where you have access to this has been a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. People are free to express their opinion as the democratization process and generally the less authoritarian government's process was kicked by the Industrial Revolution. People have means to express their opinion, whether it was in speech or being the ability to go to places to express your opinion or online, which is also a product of the Industrial Revolution. Fifthly, people communicate with other folks, not just people who are in their immediate circle, meaning that you can transcend your biases, you can talk to other people, you can generally form coalitions because you're able to travel and gather different opinions. And this is why I think on the principle, this definitely the ability to think principally on our side of the house outweighs any sort of potential principle coming from closing government. In the case you don't believe people dying from diseases, wars, masturbation, accidents, not having access to healthcare, etc., are good enough to weigh this debate, here are some good things that's developed as well, not necessarily the existential things. First of all, the communication ability to be able to talk to people outside of your community on a daily basis. Secondly, the leisure activity, not having to work 10 to 12 hours a day on the field, but actually having time, 8 in most circumstances to do things that you actually love and to not be able to not dedicate your life to working just to survive. For free, extra familiar relations that you are able to talk to people who are not inside of your basic circle of your family, who you would otherwise probably live in the pre-industrial revolution times, but also culture for masses, the ability for masses to have time for culture, the ability for them to pay for culture, the ability to engage and just enjoy reading or, I don't know, art or go to movies, go to cinemas, sports, all sorts of these things are the product of the industrial revolution, the time that you have, the money, the general accessibility, the basic concept of there's a lot of people and then they can pay me money. But fifthly, the ability to love and be loved outside of your social class and proximity, because this is Valentine's Day in the end, is something which was brought upon by the industrial revolution and the shackles that it removed from people in terms of choosing their partner. Let's talk about the survival of species. Here are things that are more important than global warming, which is unlikely to destroy the humanity as a whole. Asteroid, climate change, not man-made, mass disease, all of these things we know much more because of the industrial revolution, but also we have ability for exploring space, having a plan B, etc. But also please weigh in drops in infant mortality, like suffering, as also beneficial as an add-up argument that certain was potential climate change extinction that the governments might run. When you talk about animals, please note that outside of religious folks, there was no mass movement to not eat animals or kill them before. We have probably done a couple of ways of extinction to animals before in the agriculture era, but the only reason why people now think pigs or octopuses should have rights is because we have science that proves that and folks who believe that science is right and have access to this science and can, post about octopuses. Let's talk about recourse to government and oppression. Because when you depend on the kindness of weather or your feud, you don't really have time to engage in fighting in your rights or introduce complex governments or miss a day in the field so you can vote. This is why the initial democracy that was developed in the United States, for example, had votes on Tuesday, because that was the day when people actually traveled and could squeeze in the little time to vote when they were traveling to the fair actually. But there's no way that under the system where literally you have no representation in the government, where there's a one guy who it's usually a guy, it's not a woman, usually runs the country because they have some blood in which is usually mixed up blood because they were mixing with their immediate relatives, so it's also fucked up in that sense, rules the country, and you have no way of expressing any sort of your recourse. That happened after the industrial revolution, with people demanding more rights, with the bourgeoisie, maybe they're going to run a communist extension or something, but the bourgeoisie also happening, people demanding more rights in the end, the Enlightenment movement happening on all sorts of these things. But also recognize the oppression that you were under by religion and other norms that existed for gender to conform, for example, not have an identity and to be part of community that's inherently bad for you and coercive for you. It's a lie people don't form communities nowadays, but people have the ability to form communities that they want to form on our side of the house. And this is the comparative that both governments need to engage with, because before you were under the influence of the community that you had to belong to, and it was unimaginable that you are not religious or that you do not conform to gender stereotypes or the stereotypes of what is expected from you if you were a slave in a southern farm and the industrial revolution hit, and then you were, the country was defeated by the North, and this was your way to freedom in some extent. I want to take a POI from closing government.
Do you think it's a bad thing that humanity has the ability to resist existential risk?
Yes. No. What? No. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think this is something which is deeply, deeply ingrained in our body and ability. This is why we have survived from ages to before with the survival instinct. But I think that the difference is that on our side of the house, humanity can actually do that. And on your side of the house, humanity wants to do that, but people still die. And that's a bad thing. How do people die on their side of the house more? Look, wars that lasted for 30 and 100 years before are a period of before the Industrial Revolution, because they were slow, because these people who had all power in the world had the ability to mobilize people and to actually fight for them. This is largely when civilians died out of like starvation or were decimated for crazy purposes, or people who would rule these armies. There was no recourse in this aspect as well. So they can on comparative say that we have wars that happen after this. I would largely concede that in the past 70, 80 years, we didn't have a huge global war after World War II, exactly because of the reason that the world is so much interconnected. There's so many economic benefits, and just we have developed mechanisms because of Industrial Revolution, like the United Nations. I probably that was shit, but other mechanisms, countries depends on each other, that have stopped this from happening. So because we on that save so many lives, please vote open opposition.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the member of government here.
Hello, am I audible?
You are.
Okay, cool. Before I start my speech, I'd like to give a shout out to everyone that's watching, in particular Elaine and all the people from Ateneo who are staying up until like 2 in the morning to watch, and also Luigi who's here with me, but he's also going to speak, so he's not just watching. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Humanity is in a state of decay. We believe that the people affected by its rot, the Industrial Revolution, are put in a position that is unfair, unjust, and must be regretted. What am I going to do in this speech? I'm going to do 2 substantive things, and then obviously I'm going to respond and win on responses. But the 2 substantive things I'm going to do, first is explain why people are more comfortable in traditional sources of meaning. The framing for this point, I'm going to do it now, is simply because OG's arguments only work if people are happy in their own traditional lives, if people are happy in religions, if people are happy in their old conservative communities, and they only work if like that's proved. So we're going to prove that so that we can steal all of opening government's arguments. Then secondly, we're going to explain why you don't reach a long-term future where technology gets better, where we can solve problems, and when we can make things just better for everyone. So having said that, first some responses just to win top half already. So OO says you experience great pain in a lot of ways. OG says you have a lot of ways to mitigate it. Who should we trust? As a first response, trust neither. You should trust me and trust Monkey. Pain is a fundamentally subjective experience, but the problem is that their side allows us to grapple with this pain, which makes the experience of that pain worse. First, taking their mech directly, it was education that made it impossible to rationalize these things away. It was education, learning how to read and acquire information for ourselves that let us know that these things were bad for us, which is problematic because now we rationalize these things as bad for us and we rail against them unjustly, despite the fact that these structures may never change. Secondly, our own agency and increased power means that we contextualize this pain as our own fault. It is your fault you're not working hard enough. It's your fault you're not making a good enough wage, and it's your fault you're not good enough to get into the school you wanted to get into. Thirdly and lastly, media programming means that corporations have an incentive to make it so that we perceive it as our own fault. As a second response, OO kind of says, well, you have more will. OG says you don't care about will. The point we're making is that agency and will is not a good in the absolute, it's a good in the relative. Perhaps it might be the case that you like having more choices overall, but you'll feel more constrained if you know that you have more choices relative to these choices. And the problem is that even if it is the case that you have less absolute amount of choices in like the pre-industrial revolution world, you feel like you have more choices for the reason that you know less about the world around you. It is on your side, it is on our side where we know so much about the world, but can do so little about it. That I'm not good enough to go to the stars and I'm not good enough to explore the world, and I will die here having done nothing of consequence, having debated at a screen, but never having meant anything to anyone. So these responses win us this debate already because we've delinked everything else. Anyway, first point of material, but I'll take a POI now from OO. So get out of the way.
I'm quite certain that if you're being oppressed or tortured by a government or starving, that pain probably exists regardless of social expectations. Can you please prove this counterintuitive claim with more than assertions?
Well, the assertion I'm making is that pain is a subjective experience. If you want me to explain it even more, these are contextualized as neurons in your brain, but you're the one experiencing these neurons. So it's this subjective experience that should be weighed, not whether or not the absolute feeling of nerves hitting in your body is what should be weighed. Anyway, first of all, are these societies really oppressive? And this argument is really important to the top half debate. It's probably not important to CEO, but whatever. It's really important to the top half debate because OG's counterfactual only works if people are comfortable in traditional sources of meaning. If O or CO rightly says that people are unhappy traditionally to these sources of meaning, but like maybe they'll be persecuted for their gender or their identity, then nothing resolves because both sides have it terrible for the average person. Here are 3 structural reasons why traditional sources of meaning and traditional sources of community are less oppressive. 1, small, localized, and regionalized communities are more desperate and need all the help they can get. This means that they cannot afford social norms and cultural norms that alienate another individual. This is why actually many of the prehistoric and pre-industrial and pre-agricultural revolution societies were actually quite egalitarian, actually were matriarchal even in many situations. So it's actually the case that they cannot afford surviving by alienating someone. Secondly, power structures in these places are much less hierarchical because the relative power of both the state and authority are less. So the problems opening opposition mentions about states having guns, this is a problem that they create that they then solve, right? It's the state having capacity to surveil you, the state having capacity to shoot you from a distance, it's the state having the capacity to tell you what to do because you fear getting shot by the policeman around the corner. It's the ability for the state to enforce these things that must be curtailed. But when the state doesn't have this power, even if it is the case that there are less checks and balances, the state can just do less things against you. But thirdly and lastly is that in a small, tightly knit community, you feel less comfortable in dehumanizing someone, which is kind of the root of any and all stigma about stereotypes about another person. You're less comfortable about making these judgments about another person if you, 1, know them more, but 2, if you have less reference to work with. So these points mean that even if it is the case that there's like some trade-off, right? It is only our side, at least in closing government, that proves that people will be considerably happier because they will be less oppressed in these traditional communities. It was actually the Industrial Revolution that entrenched the roles of women in the workplace, they entrenched the roles of women in the house. For example, it was the Industrial Revolution that empowered the taking and harvesting of slaves from and allowed for the exportation of industrialism and imperialism, right? It was the Industrial Revolution that facilitated itself and became a tumor upon the face of mankind. But anyway, this first argument already wins this debate. So I've done 2 things to win this debate. Here's a third thing to win this debate, which is a second argument. So I think the actual optimal strategy for op is just to say, well, things will get better in the future eventually. Like we'll make up for all this by making lots and lots of babies, and then these babies will live like lives in the infinite utopia and like the shining infinity, right? Like they'll reach a technological singularity and things will be better for them. So the problem is that opening government relies on harm being done to lots and lots of people. This potential argument would, outframe it by saying that lots and lots of people benefit from it in the future. The response we give to this, and just the arguments for why things will never get better in the future, is threefold. The first is that corporations benefit from artificially inducing need. They benefit from the average individual being dependent on them, being dependent on their products, and being dependent on their narratives. It's why in the present day you feel the need to buy things, to do things that you don't need to do, because corporations have told you to do it, and they're slowly ingraining into society and to our politics. They have captured our government, they have captured our politicians, and they have captured our systems of governance. Moreover, secondly, global superpowers still have the capacity to emerge because now they have the capacity to export their nation without fear of reprisal, without fear of being fought back, because of the fact of the deterrence that only works on their side, because they're the only ones that have nukes, because they have drones, because they don't have to worry about civilian casualties. They put the world in a state of constant tension and conflict. It was during the Cold War that we were closest to the by the way, the POI wasn't paid, but it was during the Cold War that we were closest to like being extinct overall, right? When Stanislav Petrov nearly pressed the button that ended the world 10 times over. It is only when global superpowers have the capacity to emerge that we are closer to this death. But thirdly and lastly is that qualitatively in the future, climate change and resource exhaustion forces us to live in a state of hellish decline. They only said that this is a threat to our humanity. We say this is also a threat to your quality of life. When you live in a state of hellish decline, when products are scarce, when we're running out of bees, chocolate, coal, energy, everything that you need to survive, and yet desire these things become massively expensive. These things become controlled by corporations. Why should you care about the future the most? 1, there are more people in the future. 2, they have no control over the past. They have no authority or consent to what we're doing onto them. And 3, we have a responsibility to them because we're taking away the resource that they themselves could have had. At the end of the speech, we do 2 things. The first is we're really, really glad to debate in this tournament. We quite enjoyed it. And the second thing is we take the fucking dub. Affirm.
Proposition. Here, here.
Hello, testing my microphone. Can I be heard properly? All right, sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Luigi. My preferred gender pronouns are he and they. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat. So I'm going to want to chat for all of your POIs. Let me just open the chat. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. This is a debate about reimagining humanity and how we structure society. Humanity is more than being a cog in the machine for mass production. We may not have diseases and we may have a lot of convenience stores to choose from, but we lead lives that already lead us to die every single day when we go to work and try to fit in with this unfettered mass consumerist and commercialized lifestyle. This is what we brought you at Closing Government that was unresponded to. Two issues in this debate. Number one, what is the comparative in this debate and why do we need to have a lot more imagination in this debate? And number two, what is the future of humanity and why we still win? Number one, what is the comparative in this debate? So again, this is a debate about lifestyle choices and how we can structure our lifestyle around society. So it's obviously about the trend in which mass production eroded agrarian lifestyles and how we could structure our communities on that basis. So I want to be very clear. Most of the standards for the good life that opening opposition tries to hinge their entire case on are unimportant and are resolved by the counterfactual that David presented uniquely in his speech with his analysis extension with the continuation of the agrarian life for the following reasons. Four specific things. Number one, these communities would be very small, would be very tightly well knit, and would depend heavily on one another, and obviously would be smaller, very, very much in number. What does this mean? It means there would be no need for urbanization to create more cities. There would be no need to travel to other places and be vulnerable to diseases. There would be no need to form governments or robust democratic structures or any type of system of power sharing agreements to fixate on one's wages or one's pay or one's role in society. So again, to preempt the argument from closing opposition, if you were talking about the caste system and how people were designated roles, that was actually preempted by an agrarian lifestyle that tried as much as possible to democratize these roles and decentralize it from those feudal lords to begin with, because people depended on one another. Families depended on one another. They centered their lives around life and death rituals, being able to revise themselves in terms of the power structures they were currently working with, instead of the counterfactual, where power structures by imperialist structures replace these agrarian lifestyles and feudal lords with other governments that would also be even more oppressive because they'd be much larger. They have a greater capacity and more control and more technology to be able to center their lives around mass production with respect to centering their valuation for their states and the GDP and their competition against other states as well, because of the fact that you force them to be more interconnected with one another. So our argument was we are actually less hierarchical on our side relative to their side, even on the basis of technology. So in terms of bargaining power, in terms of being able to get better decision-making process for these individuals, the dependence, the over-reliance on one another in all of these systems and work for people, even if a lot of them would die and they'd center around their family and generations over and over again, that is still a very, very strong, well-knit society where people can have meaning-making opportunities to make relationships with one another. I think that is the value presented at Gov. Secondly, they would not be pressured to produce overcapacity because of commercial forces. So obviously, subsistence farming gives time for more people to use their time for other endeavors that are more meaningful for them, like religion, like other opportunities, like making relationships with more and more people, or being able to just talk with one another, or just relax and rest. That's a good thing. They wouldn't need to get an education, spend 4 years in college, work 8 to 5, be unhappy in a hedonic treadmill that is even more unhappy for most individuals that live at 30 or 40 ages right now in the status quo. That is comparatively better if you think about the experiences that people can make in the status quo, especially if you think how the agrarian lifestyle can develop or at least work with that subsistence farming more and more in time because of the interactions they can make with each other, especially if people still continue to live on even though it's another generation and they live a shorter life compared to more people. So the comparative is that their side values people relative to a global competition. So for example, you need to export workers to work in another place, which is also modern day slavery to a certain degree, which also reduces their consent in many situations. Or for example, they'd compete with global wages, where more often than not, their wages would be depressed at a very significant rate and they still wouldn't be happy. On that basis, we still believe that an agrarian lifestyle is able to correct for these factors on the basis of being able to say that we just rely on food, we rely on surviving, we rely on protecting one another. So we spin and flip most of opening opposition's argument. But three, they would not have to continuously develop technology to have a patent system, have corporations, or have an interconnected world for the reasons we provided to you. We significantly mitigate the potentiality of imperialism going wrong and being worse. And the last thing I want to be very clear with is that we take away the existential threat and the existential worries that pervade society today. The only reason we are worried about solving climate change so much is because of the fact we created these problems ourselves, because of the Industrial Revolution. So absent this possibility, we believe it's simply much better where people would not have to have short, luxurious lives or convenient lives that would be limited to a certain degree on their model and still reverse back with worse climate change in the future if people would rely so much on this commercialized system. So the norms in which we structure society and the pressures of being able to think about the pressure of war, the pressure of nuclear technology, the pressure of climate change being worse in the future, all of these were born out of the Industrial Revolution and are absolutely taken away when people just don't have to worry about that in the status quo with agrarian lifestyles.
Some people are happy forming communities in the status quo. Many others die of starvation and famine and have no choice. Is it really fair for proposition to only analyze the upside without analyzing the hundreds of millions of people that die?
No. So obviously, if someone wants to create a small commune today, then that's exactly what led to the bad things of the Great Leap Forward, because those were the same communities that were disenfranchised disproportionately because the default was a commercialized system that relied on competing with other nations and an arms race or a production race against other nations at the same time simultaneously. Reimagine the world. We are better with an agrarian lifestyle that was much simpler, much more controlled, much more predictable. Issue 2, future of humanity. Closing opposition again accuses us of having a social system that assigns roles. Number 1, we make these roles less and less important in our model. So to the extent that roles are created on both sides, we presented to you many reasons as to why roles and caste system is also created in terms of labor, in terms of structural inequality, in terms of structural poverty, because of the reasons they also presented on their side, because of a commercialized and mass production motivated system that is reduced significantly with an agrarian lifestyle. But 2, the over focus on these roles is worse in their model, and we simply reparate for that in the vast majority of instances. Because of these reasons, propose.